Well, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's talk, From Research to Practice, Bridging the Academic and Publishing Worlds. We're thrilled to have Dr. David Dockterman here with us. I am Sarita Pillay. I am with the Center for Innovative Research and Cyber Learning, or CIRCL as we're known, and we are sponsoring today's webinar with Dr. Dockterman as our guest. I want to welcome those of you in the room. We are actually broadcasting live from a conference center. As well as those of you who have joined us online. And so welcome and thank you for joining us on the webinar portion of this talk. For those of you online, just a few logistical things. Just want to point out that all phone lines are muted, but we do have staff monitoring the questions and comments box if you're in the Adobe Connect room. So if you have comments, for Dr. Dockterman, questions, there will be a Q&A at the end of his presentation. We will be monitoring your questions and making sure that we pose them along with questions that come from the audience. So also feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box and you can have a conversation amongst yourselves too about some of what you'll hear today. Other logistical stuff, we will be posting an archived recording of the webinar on the CIRCL site, and that'll be available later this week. But before I turn it over to Dr. Dockterman, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of who we are at CIRCL. The Center for Innovative Research in Cyber Learning, or CIRCL as we're known, is led by SRI International in partnership with Education Development Center, where we are broadcasting from today, EDC, and the organization that I'm a part of, as well as NORC. And CIRCL is really here to support the field of cyber learning researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders. More specifically, we support existing as well as prospective cyber learning projects that are funded by the National Science Foundation's Cyber Learning and Future Learning Technologies program, as well as by the variety of other programs at the National Science Foundation that make up the Cross-Directorate Cyber Learning Initiative at NSF. And as you can see from this slide, CIRCL's work is essentially focused on nurturing community amongst projects, amongst investigators, amongst those who are new to the field of cyber learning, addressing common needs of this community, and working collectively to really plan for and create greater impacts in the field of cyber learning. Some specific ways in which we do this is hosting events like this and webinars, as well as thematic face-to-face events. We provide individualized brokering assistance, such as connecting people and specific projects, helping locate research, evaluation, and other resources that might be useful to those implementing current cyber learning work or thinking about prospective work. I'll talk a little bit about the website in a second, but another strand of our work includes portfolio analysis, which is really aimed at understanding the portfolio of projects funded by NSF in this area, and then sharing data about those projects with as needed. And finally, another core area of work is around broadening participation in the portfolio of projects funded by NSF in this area, to include those that are currently institutions and individuals that are currently underrepresented in their portfolio. So I'll show you like I said, I'll actually show you the website, more sections of this website in a minute. Really, our website is designed to be a resource in a variety of different ways to the field, and hopefully will be of use to some of you in this room. Our website is a tool for collaboration and for connecting with others. We have perspectives featuring researchers, practitioners, industry professionals, and other stakeholders in the field. And so it's a great way to sort of get to know people and perhaps seek out partnerships with people who have common or synergistic work going on. You can find detailed information about cyber learning projects, which can give you a sense of what cyber learning looks like in action, cyber learning on the ground. You can access a resource library from the CIRCL website as well, and there's a number of resources there. I'll point out a couple. CIRCL primers are essentially really excellent, high-quality overviews of some really fundamental, important cyber learning concepts, which can be very useful, and there's important literature related to each of those that are also part of the primers. We also have a whole section of the website on funding opportunities and proposal development, really targeted to the NSF program that funds these cyber learning projects at NSF. As I said, we have face-to-face events. We have a variety of thematic webinars, and all of those are archived. All the information related to that is archived on the website as well. So I just want to encourage you to stay in touch with CIRCL. Follow us via social media, sign up for our newsletter, and if you're not already part of this vibrant community of practice, please join us. So With no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter for today. Dr. David Dockterman operates at the intersection of research and practice. In 1982, he helped found Tom Snyder Productions, an early pioneer in educational technology, while getting his doctorate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Over the last 30-plus years, he has continued to balance lives in the academic and publishing worlds, serving now as chief architect of the learning sciences for Houghton Mifflin Harcourt and adjunct lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In both roles, Dr. Dockterman supports the development of research-driven innovative practices to tackle challenging educational problems. Productive failure and a growth mindset fuel innovation and learning, and Dr. Dockterman has become adept at infusing the underlying research from behavioral psychology and cognitive science to foster those dispositions among students, teachers, and institutional leaders. He is a fellow of the International Society for Design and Development in Education and an editorial board member for the journal Science of Learning. Please welcome Dr. David Dockterman.
Thanks. Thank you for the introduction. As you heard, I came to Harvard in 1982 to get my doctorate, and I just never left. I did finish my doctorate. Some of the people I came with I don't think did. And that same year, I met some folks and helped found Tom Snyder Productions. That company was acquired by Scholastic, so I moved to the Scholastic. The division at Scholastic that I was a part of was recently acquired by HMH. And so by staying in the same place, I've had my worlds change around me constantly, except for the Harvard one, and that has changed too. So I've been living in this space, sort of treading this line between the academic and the commercial world for a long time. And so over the years, when I first started doing this, I first started teaching at Harvard in 1990-91. There really wasn't, back then, there wasn't something, people didn't talk about design-based research or research-based design or design-based implementation research or design thinking or human-centered design or all these other kinds of approaches out there. We just kind of did stuff. And but over the years, it has a process that's evolved that looks kind of like this now, and this is a representation of how this sort of research to practice approach works at what was Scholastic and now is called the Intervention Solutions Group at HMH, which involves leveraging research and evidence to help figure out what we should do or what we should tackle, and then what we should do and whether or not what we did works. And while it says stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, there really is much more of a dynamic relationship. And so while there's all this talk about research to this, research to that, research-based this, research-based that, when it comes to inventing things new, it really isn't research that guides what we do. It's really the theory about our belief that guides what we do. So, quick example, we all have theories of learning. We often don't articulate them. We carry them around with us. So if you, for instance, are walking along in a school or on the street and you see a little girl struggling to tie her shoes, what do? Do you go over and say, let me do that for you? Do you say, watch me, now you try it? Do you break it down in steps? Do you give her a URL and say, watch this tonight? And we'll do a little flip thing in the morning. But there's something that guides you about how you're going to interact. And some of that has to do with, well, this is what I think will work. And underlying that theory, hopefully, is some kind of evidence or research, and of varying qualities. It might be, I've actually read studies on the most effective way to teach small girls how to tie their shoelaces, and I'm going to enact that here. Or it might be, this worked for my kid, or somebody said they did this, and I'm going to try that. So you have all kinds of different qualities of evidence, research broadly defined, that you then distill into a theory that guides your action. And so what I want to do is kind of break this apart this afternoon and kind of quickly walk you through 5 points. And first, about how evidence can help you make sure you have a correct theory of the problem you want to solve. How evidence can guide then a theory of action. How you then test that out, iterating in context, what it means to scale that up, and how do you build a culture that values research So that's what I wanted to do with some quick stories and then have time. Is this cool for people? I'm assuming that I see nodding heads here, and I'm looking at the camera, and I see nodding heads there too. So it really was a rhetorical question, if that was okay. But I wanted to give you some agency in this. It didn't really matter if you nodded yes or no. It's what was going to happen. Okay, so let me start by talking about finding the right problem. And I think this is really important in the technology space in particular, because technology has this habit of defining the problem based on what the new technology does and the old technology didn't do. And so you can see this, like there's a current wave around VR, virtual reality, and that this is going to allow kids to experience other worlds like they've never experienced before. And because they have virtual reality, this is going to give them a new sense of empathy and awareness of all these worlds. Now, that's kind of what was said 100 years ago about motion pictures, that motion pictures were going to wipe out narrow-minded prejudices. I think that's actually the quote, and open up worlds to kids because now they could see these things. And so, well, the problem with that, which apparently didn't work since not everybody is, all you have to do is listen to the political world today. Narrow-minded prejudices are not gone. That didn't work. But now the reason it didn't work is because, well, that wasn't like real enough. And so now we have virtual reality as opposed to just watching something. But what motion pictures was replacing was something from 50 years earlier. In the middle to latter half of the 19th century, there was something called magic lanterns. Anybody remember using those? You're nodding, but so I don't think you're that old. So magic lanterns were like early versions of overhead projectors, except they used flame. And so it was all about showing big pictures on the wall. And people used to love going to lantern shows and in people's parlors or at little auditoriums. And it's like, that's the thing. See, books were so dull, and caricatures, the drawings in books were so boring. Here you had big pictures on the wall. So the problem was we didn't have big pictures on the wall. Now that we have big pictures on the wall, kids are going to see the world in a new way. Motion pictures came along and said, you know why the big pictures on the wall didn't work? It's because they didn't move. We now have moving pictures on the wall. We've solved the problem. And then, of course, then they added sound. These were silent moving pictures, and we added sound. Radio and TV promised immediacy because that wasn't working, and now we have virtual reality. So we have this cycle of technology kind of defining the problem sort of within itself. And missing in all this is, like, where's the research on how people develop empathy? Like, shouldn't that be guiding what we do and developing a theory around that? So I think it's really important in the world of technology to kind of get out of it and go a little deeper. And so what I like to propose is I like to borrow something actually from some work by Neustadt and May in the mid-1980s. They wrote a book called Thinking in Time, and in that book they talk about the Goldberg Rule. And by that, it's great. The Goldberg Rule is named after this guy, Avram Goldberg, who was, at the time, the CEO of Stop and Shop, which is still around, but not the same, but it's a grocery store chain. And so Avram Goldberg, he'd have managers come in and say, here's the problem. And Goldberg would say, don't tell me the problem, tell me the story. I'll figure out what the problem is. And so to make sure at the outset, when we're trying to figure out what's going on, we often jump to a solution, but before we start solving, let's hear the story. Because people can look at the same situation and see lots of different problems in it. So let's step back, not be guided by what the new technology can do, but what's the story, what's really going on? And so I'll give you an example from 1990s Orange County, Florida. So Orange County, Florida, as you probably know, is a land-bound county in Florida that's also the home to Disney World and lots of things that are not real. But in the 1990s, it was also home to a huge dropout problem. And so here you have this problem that's in the news, What can we do to turn around Florida's dropouts? We have this huge issue. We have to do something. So if that's what you know, we have a dropout. That's what the data says. Huge number of dropouts. Florida ranked 48th in high school graduation rates among the 50 states at that time. So what do? How do you respond to the data? Somebody says, we have a dropout problem. And what's your immediate reaction? Well, school's not engaging enough. Maybe we need better vocational programs. We need to make it more interesting for kids. But the people in Orange County, the school folks, they had dug a little deeper and actually got to know their students and their stories. And that's why they reached out to Vanderbilt and Ted Hasselbring at the time, because he was doing this interesting stuff on helping struggling students learn how to read. Because the problem, what they found when they dug into the story, was that kids weren't coming to school not because school wasn't interesting, but because they couldn't read. And they were embarrassed. So they stopped coming. Now, it's the data, dropouts, can lead you lots of different ways. But digging into the story begins to unravel what's going on. So you have kids who have a fluency and decoding issues, but you have a lot of kids who have a background knowledge issue. So there's a lot now in here to dig into what's really driving this. Why is this a problem? Why can't kids read? Again, digging into the story underneath. And ultimately, this was the proving ground for Read 180, which the sort of the biggest reading intervention program in the country. But only because people dug beneath the surface. So I can give you a sort of a deeper example, one I know a little bit more at with Read 180, and it actually has an intersection with EDC. So Read 180 was really successful, and the folks at the time at Scholastic said we should make Math 180. So we came to, actually I came to EDC, and we started something. And we stopped that in part because we were jumping toward a solution before we'd figured out really what the problem was. And as you look at this, again, you've got data. So you've got data that, like, everybody sucks at math. Like, nobody, okay, Asian subgroup are the only ones that are sort of consistently over half the students are proficient. But everybody was doing badly in math. Why? So the data doesn't tell you why. And so what's underneath it? What's causing this? So again, now it's like, there's lots of evidence of potential problems. There's this whole mindset thing that's coming out, and this was 15 years ago, I think, starting this research. So this was really new at the time. So reached out to everybody. Talked to neuroscientists. How does the brain register math? Talked to content folks. Reached out to Carol Dweck. And then there's this whole issue about teachers. Is it because teachers don't know how to teach math? They're uncredentialed? There's so many elements here. What problem do we want to solve? And so there's a piece of this that is the evidence helping you figure out what the right problem is. And I think very often we jump to a solution before we know what we're trying to solve. So here, as I said, it's like teachers, who do I go? It's like we reached out to Deborah Ball. I went to Singapore. I got to be friends with almost all the authors of the Common Core math standards. Made a relationship with Mindset Works through Carol Dweck. SRI helped us really dig in and understand what the issues were, CAST, different students, special ed students, language issues. There's so much in here to provide guidance about what to do. So there's a piece of this when, on the publisher side, to understand, like, it's diving in deep, what's going on, to then figure out really a theory of the problem. Students are not being successful. Students are dropping out because there's a theory to drive that. And that's the theory of the problem. The next step, the data gives you scale, story. So it wasn't just going and talking to experts. There was a piece of this that's let's gather teachers together, let's talk to them, and then going in and meeting students. So the data gives you this scale, the stories give you nuance. So getting in and getting stories from people that are tangible and real, so that when you think about this, you're actually accumulating. And I mean this, it's so often that the people who are developing things live in a little bubble. And I want all of them to have pictures of who they're developing for, that there are real users. And I remember we were in Lowell with some middle school students, and I remember one middle school student who became one of these reference points, one of these kind of real people that we talked about. And I'm sitting with her, and we gave her a bunch of math things. We gave these kids a bunch of math problems to do, and then we looked at what they did, and we'd sit and interview them. And one of these girls, middle school girls, she'd skipped this problem. It was something like 128 minus something equals 100. She'd skipped it. So I said, why'd you skip that? Wasn't sure. So what do you think? 128 minus equals 100. She said, 67. Wow, okay. And I thought that, like, how hard can this be to fix? I didn't really appreciate the depth of her sort of blankness in this until I got to talk to her. And those people, as you go and build out the nuance, the realness that often gets masked in the large-scale data, you now have people that you are designing for. And they become kind of, anytime you now come up with a theory of action, an idea of something to try, you can almost run it through them mentally. Is that going to work with Kristalina? Is that going to work with this other kid or that kid or this kid? Is this teacher going to be able to do that? There is a realness that has to come together to kind of flesh out the large-scale data piece. And then you're working from the problem, the theory of the problem, to a theory of action. And it's very much, my son is in medical school, so I'm very focused on these medical analogies. And when last year we went to a parent weekend. Who knew they had parent weekend for medical school? It was cool. So we go, and we get to go through some of the interview process that the students went through. And part of it was doing a mock interview with a patient. So it's like you're a doctor. So the parents are in there, and they have actors. And I was just reading about there are people who make a living almost being actors at medical schools, and they pretend to be patients. And you think maybe that's it's a sideline, but you get good at it. They become ill. I mean, but part of this is when somebody comes in complaining of some symptoms, doctors take their histories, because there are so many different reasons, potential reasons, to explain what those symptoms are for. And if you've had, sadly, if you've had people who, in your family or yourself, who've had illnesses where the diagnosis is of unknown etiology, you know that medicine isn't as clear-cut as people often think. There are lots of potential causes. And so in the same way, that first step is really taking the patient's history, the school, the kids, the teachers, whoever it is, so that you can come up with a theory. This is how House, the TV show, worked. Right? Think about it. It's so many different theories about what could be going wrong, and it takes them an hour to basically almost kill the patient over and over again before they find a treatment that matches the diagnosis. We're talking about a much more complex kind of place. But now you go you have to have a theory of what the problem is in order to drive a theory of action to treat it. And so what evidence, what can you gather to help make sure you have the right problem? And now, wow, is there a clear theory of action? So for Math 180, I'm not claiming our execution was perfect, but the theory behind it, driving a theory of action, that one of the things we have to do is make sure that we get the content right. That a lot of these kids, they need more time. They're lacking foundations. Let's make sure we focus on the right content, not try and cover everything. So what's the right thing to do? What's the right content? But our theory of action is we're going to make sure we do the right content in the right way so there's real depth of understanding. Because without that, it's the same thing every year. They forget every year. We want to make sure that they really get it. We need to make sure that teachers are equipped to teach that and to engage these students. And we need to build in this, like there's this whole cultural thing that it's okay to be bad at math. So we need to shift that. We're going to infuse a growth mindset in here for students and their teachers so that they're all like, okay, I believe I can do this. I believe I can reach these kids. And the kids believe that it's something they can do. So then it's really, the development team, for us, actually writes stories themselves about what they're going to do and what evidence and research is guiding it. So they're actually more than this. So what's our mindset story? What's our content story? What's our teacher story? Here are the things we plan to do, our actions and innovations, and the evidence supporting that. And one of the values of this exercise is it highlights the places where you're making bigger leaps. Because the research, the evidence, doesn't always, it often doesn't tell you what to do. If it did, we wouldn't be in business. We wouldn't be constantly struggling to figure this stuff out. So we have to make leaps. Where we're making the biggest leaps, where the evidence is weakest, those are the places we need to do the most testing and iteration. But it is a part of this, and part of this also is that the people at the development level, these aren't researchers, these are publishers. This is the development team, the publisher. They're engaged. They need to know the research to support what they're doing. It isn't just going through a checklist. This is what it's about. And again, I want everybody to have a picture of who these kids are, who the teachers are, so that we have a clear picture of what we're trying to change. So here it's like, we're talking to Carol Dweck, we're getting guidance on mindset, here's what we're going to do. We have some ideas from programs that have been out there. Content, I went to Singapore, I met the folks in Singapore. Bill McCallum became one of our advisors, one of the authors of the Common Core. But they don't always know. So you want to have, you're kind of measuring your confidence level. Where is it high? This thing has always worked. And where is it low? It's like, oh, it's worked here but not there, and we haven't really tried that. And so you iterate. Where are the places that we really need to find out if it's going to work? We don't know. When you innovate, when you're creating something new, the chances are it's not going to work. I mean, the chances are very high it's not going to work. So you have to put yourself in a position where you're going to learn about that. In the world of research, that's kind of what you do, hopefully. But in the world of publishing, that's not the way it normally works. You're out there to get stuff done. Well, we need to iterate because we want to do stuff that actually works. That's only good if you actually are willing to listen to the feedback. And that's not easy. It's not easy because of time, but it's also not easy because of ego. And I'll get to that in a moment. I like the model from, I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Harford's book. It's not about education. It's about iteration, why success always starts with failure, adapt. And it's very simple, right? You're going to try something new. We haven't solved this before, so let's have lots of things in our pocket. Because the thing we try first is probably not going to work. Let's test it in a place where when it does fail, and it probably will, it's not a catastrophe. So it's not like, well, that didn't work, we're done, throw it all out. Let's find places where the stakes are low, and we have clear feedback on whether or not it's successful. Because otherwise, we're not learning. And so what does that look like? Well, there's a piece of this that is, you do a theoretical test with your advisors. I mean, I accumulate, it's part of what my job is, accumulating advisors, experts in the field from all different aspects. And it's like, here's what we plan to do. Think it'll work? And the best advisors will say, I don't know, let's try it. Some will say, yes, that was my idea. They're not the best advisors. They may have confidence, but the best ones realize we got to try it. And certainly having worked with Ted Hasselbring for a long time, who's done a lot of stuff, he says that a lot. I don't know, let's try it. So you can do a theoretical test with your advisors, because if they say, no way, okay, I don't need to waste time going deeper. We can use teachers as proxies. Will you use this? Will you try this? If we're making something for the classroom, they can be proxies a bit for, give you some insight for how well they think that'll work, or even if they're willing to do it. And then, like, let's do these flash tests with students. It's so different today than it was in the 80s when I was first doing this. I mean, Amy, I was director of playtesting at Tom Snyder Productions. I spent my life in classrooms. And in those days, you just walked into classrooms. I go to Boston Public Schools, I go to Cambridge Public Schools. You go in, you test stuff out, everybody's happy. No Corey checks, no, we're doing a test, we're test prep today. It's much harder today than it used to be to actually get in and find out if stuff works. And that's a killer because you don't know it's going to work until you test it. And so we need mechanisms to be able to do this. So we work with, we often work with companies that do what they call flash labs. They bring kids in. Let's test it. It's a little artificial, but it gives you some sense of whether it's actually going to work with the audience, whether that's kids or teachers. It's not the same as a focus group. A focus group is okay to kind of feel like, well, what do you like? What do you want? This is actually testing an idea. Testing, like, here's the innovation. Here's the thing we want to try. Let's see if it works. What kind of feedback? And then you have to develop partnerships with schools. But it's not as simple as it used to be. But you do. And often, I mean, to some extent, because we have a lot of schools that have been part of our programs, of Read 180 and other programs over the years, we have a lot of people who are willing to play with us to some extent. But it's complicated. And lots of forms to fill out, and lots of waivers, and lawyers. It's complicated. You really want to focus on where the biggest leaps are. You don't need to test the stuff that's already been well tested. It's good to do it in context. I'm not saying don't, but you want to focus on the things that you have the less evidence for, where there's less likely. So test early when the investment is low. And one of the reasons to do that is because the more you've invested in something, the more you have your ego at stake. And having taught classes in innovation for 15 years or more at Harvard, it's one of the hardest things because you become focused on proving yourself right rather than solving the problem, which means you have to be willing to listen to the feedback. You actually have to, you want it to fail. When I have students who come to me after they work on these projects and they get it out there, it's like, fail early, fail often. It's this sort of, the entrepreneurial mantra. And I get an email saying, it really bombed. I think we have to go back to the beginning. And I say, that's awesome. And it's like, really? Yeah. I mean, you just you don't have to do that anymore. You found out something that's really valuable. Let's reconfigure. Which means you have to recognize that failure is okay. Ego suppression is a part of the process. Otherwise, you're out there to prove yourself right. And it's really easy. We're humans, right? We get defensive. When somebody challenges us, we want to defend it. We want to explain. It's not about that. It's about doing something that's effective. So let's make sure we get the right problem. Let's have a theory of action to address those problems, and let's be sure we're testing them out. And then let's see if the thing we've created actually works within context for different students, with whom and when and under what circumstances is it effective. And this is something that the Intervention Solutions Group has done really well. So there are 1 million students a day using Read 180, and there's data flowing in all the time. And there have been so many studies, not just to validate it, but to learn. And there's a new version of Read 180 that's just launching, Read 180 Universal, and part of that is built on what we've learned from years of monitoring what's going on. So you've got the big data stuff, but then you want to go in and say, okay, what's it like? Because not everybody is doing it the same way. In San Antonio, it was a 90-minute model. That's how it started. This is the way it's effective. This is what we tested. And you go to a school and say, we don't have that time. Well, let's see how it works here. It's like where the rubber meets the road. No matter how much you test, and no matter how many places you go, it's a big world. And you're going to find places that aren't like any place you tested. And so what's going on there? And how does it work in a regular class period? And how does it work in a 90-minute class? What works better? Well, what works better here? What do we do to make sure it works well in these circumstances? So you dig in. Again, you're kind of operating at multiple levels. And fortunately, there's this whole area that's emerged around design-based implementation research or improvement science that's trying to really solidify, recognize that innovations take time and that the implementation of them is its own thing. So no matter what you've done in the research, in the lab that's worked, when it comes to actually putting it in context, it's complicated. So we need ways to measure that. Right? There are so many, I talk about contextual constraints or contextual variables. Teachers, how well are they trained? What's going on? And how much time do they have? And what resources? What's the physical layout? There's so many things to look at to help understand what will make this successful. And that's a different goal from, does it work? Does it work? What does that even mean? Because the implementation is what will determine whether or not it's successful. So it's really coming at this, what do we have to do? And now that means you're pushing the boundaries of fidelity. Because your studies, before you launched it, say, this is how to do it for it to work. But there are only 3 places in the world that can actually match that lab, that experience. Okay, so what do you have to do, and where can you play around the edges? And if you're playing around the edges, how do you make sure that it's still going to be successful? So part of this is really monitoring. So a lot of the studies, as a publisher, you want evidence that the thing works, but you also want to have guidance on how to make it be successful. It's rare that you hand something, I don't even like the word solution. It's what the world uses now. But solution kind of implies, I bought it, it should work. And it's not the way it happens in life. Humans implement things. Attitudes and beliefs. If a teacher is rolling her eyes at having to teach phonics or going back and doing whole number multiplication again with these kids, my dog reads my emotions. I'm sure my students do as well. They know. And if the teacher's rolling her eyes, why should the kid put time in? So attitudes and beliefs matter as well. So you have so many different elements to track here. And again, you've got data, but you also want to get into those classrooms. You want to be there and have the stories to give the nuance. Because the data will say it worked or it didn't work. It doesn't tell you why. It doesn't tell you why there's a problem, what's causing the problem, and it doesn't tell you why your thing is or isn't working. So again, you want to have that stuff happening. And ultimately, you end up with a process that's something like there's research foundations, what's guiding what we should do, and there's a back and forth because you have an idea. I have an idea for how we can tackle this. Is there any research or evidence supporting that? Let's see. If there isn't, I really need to iterate on that so that when I go and actually now develop it and implement it, I want to track that as well and ultimately see whether or not it works. And these things are constantly feeding one another. So research is kind of built into every step of the process. And that's how we approach it. And that's sort of just kind of the way we grew up. I don't know what we call it. We call it best practice or something. But I sometimes use evidence-based design. I don't know. I should come up with a name, though, that's sort of some amalgamation of all the different things that are out there. So how do you build a culture that embraces this? And I'm talking about for all the players, too. So on the academic side, I talk to researchers. They're doing their research. They want you to follow that research. The publishers want to get stuff out there and show that it works, maybe. At what level of quality do they want to show it works? What kind of studies are they doing? It's like there are different levels. I got anecdotes. I got case studies. It worked really well. Here's a before and after. Well, there should be an after. I don't care what you did. If you did nothing, there should be an after. You need at least a comparison group. Randomized trials are tough. How do you instill a culture on the publishing end that values the research? How do you instill a culture on the academic end that recognizes that it's a big world? You want to make sure that it's something that's scalable. So, this model of evidence theory and innovation, how they relate, it's really sort of academic, commercial, and the context in which those things are applied. So just a quick little bit of, maybe it's solicited advice, since I was invited here. So solicited advice for each of these players. And I know there are others because there are funders and there's foundations and NSF and DOE and everybody else. But for these guys, for the academics, stay rigorous. We need good evidence somewhere in here, and the publishers won't always pay for it. And sometimes this is where the government comes in, because it's expensive to do. But at the same time as staying rigorous, lighten up a bit. Recognize that when we're taking research to scale, it is a partnership to make sure we have something that can make an impact. And this is part of the challenge of sort of holding the folks scaling up accountable, making sure they have integrity to the research, but also recognizing that just because we didn't do it your way doesn't mean another way, a variation of it, won't work. Which gets to the point of share what didn't work. I mean, the publishing world is very big on what worked, and you've seen this stuff before, it's not that great on the publishing world, I mean the academic publishing world, is not that great on publishing results of what didn't work. That's really good to know, so that we don't have to duplicate the mistake over and over again. So let's not do what doesn't work, but there are variations, right? And part of that is meeting this tension between fidelity and reality. And get in the context. Get in as many contexts as you can. And I know that it varies. And different academics, different researchers I work with have different degrees of kind of mixing it up. But it's good to have those, both the scale up and for the academics to have both the scale up and the stories, the kind of personal piece too. And on the developer side, I mean, what I do, I mean, this is part of my job, I guess, is I make research a norm. So every week I distribute, I have a big subscription, thank you Kim Marshall to the Marshall Memo, which I distribute internally, along with other tidbits from the research. So every week, it's just part, and then it's out there. And I want people talking about the research. Wow, that's interesting. Wow, there's stuff. So if there's something interesting on embodied cognition, I want everybody to be talking about it. It's how we do business. It's what we do. It's the norm. We're talking about and tracking the research. Bringing in researchers to talk to us. Sometimes they're advisors, sometimes they're researchers. I had Dan Willingham come in and give a talk when we were part of SCLAP, give a talk to everybody. Who else can I bring in? Who else can we do? And it's part of Francie Alexander, who heads the research team, chief academic officer for the Intervention Solutions Group. If we're bringing in somebody to talk to the development team, I want them to talk to everybody. Not just a small group. Talk to everybody. Then we can get together. So again, it's part of the buzz. It's part of the culture. Make it happen. And then make research, you got to put a little money in. And not just on the validation part, but on all phases. Right? It is part of the process all along the way. And part of it is making it something you document. So having developers write the story for each one of the elements that includes the evidence and research supporting what they're doing is part of that. It's the way we do things. You have to make it a norm. And for intervention, that's what it's all. Intervention is all about changing the lives of kids. You want to have evidence that that's actually happening. And then on the educator side, get over just covering the standards. I mean, this is part of the. There's a particularly for sort of core instruction. There's a set of standards. Maybe it's a shorter set of standards now than it was. But the focus is on, did you cover all the standards? In the intervention world, you know that didn't work, so you're focusing on changing the trajectory of kids. You really need evidence. I want consumers to be more demanding and not just looking at the content, but looking at the impact. And I'm not seeing all that there yet. And also, there's a real draw to shiny and new. So if you actually, I did a little bit of sort of survey of what innovation means and what drives innovation. And if you talk to an economist, they have a different view of innovation than if you talk to a biologist. Economists, innovation is what makes capitalism work. You have something new. You have new and improved. Without new and improved, Apple's under fire because they're not innovative enough. They can't keep making the same thing. They have to have something that now gets you to buy the new thing. That's how capitalism works. So it's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be effective. It has to be new and interesting. And there's a drive that is in this. And in biology, innovation actually may be a way for members of a group to distinguish themselves. It's like having peacock's feathers. It's like bright feathers. I'm innovative. Whales, there's some biologists believe that whales vary their songs from year to year to kind of, they're cool. There's no value to it other than, wow, that's kind of cool. And that they get mates that way. It's basically all about sex. But that innovation is a driver. We're drawn to new. For the business we're in, new is not enough. And ego gets in here as well, the status thing. So schools who are going like, they want to be the first to give everybody an iPad. They want to be the first to do the virtual reality. What are you using it for? What problem are you solving? I got all the new toys. I'm leading the way. For what? They haven't defined, it's like, it's true for everybody. What problems are you trying to solve? And let's understand that really well. So we all have to get over that, and I think this is, again, sort of on the consumer side of this. And to recognize that it's not, you don't just buy a package and drop it in. Implementation quality matters. I don't care how good it is, it matters. And so this is where there really is a partnership among all of us to make sure that we are successful. It's not about proving did it work or not, but how do we make it be successful for kids. So, I used to say questions and comments, and I always said, everybody has questions. You want to give people direction. So what's your research to practice plan? I give to you. We're trying to always hone what we do. And I'm now happy to answer questions. Is that the plan? So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. So we have time for some questions, either online or in the room. Just make sure you have a microphone if you're in the room.
So if we are approaching a publisher and we go with all of this, I don't know anything about publishing. So if I went and said, I have an idea that there's a problem and I want to figure out how to address it, but first I'm going to have to I'll bring in all of these experts, and then I'm going to have to do all of these testing, and then eventually I'll get around to writing. I mean, how do you approach a publisher if you want to go through all these steps?
Right, so it's a great question of who pays for what part of this process. And so, and that partly depends on, so let's work through a few models. The commercial world, particularly in education, the economics do not allow the commercial world to pay for the kind of R&D that the drug companies can get away with, right? It just doesn't work. So what the commercial world wants, they want stuff that they can use, not experiments. So who pays for the experiments? I mean, this is where the government and foundations to some extent come in to kind of fund the research piece to this, the initial research. But I do think there are places for partnerships in this and in growing something. You need something that can get to a revenue stream to support it pretty quickly. And part of this is then this kind of relationship where, with schools, to recognize that you are growing something together. But you're in a space of do no harm. You want to make sure that what you start with isn't a total bust, because it's just, schools don't have time to mess around. So for part of what I do is I'm like a scout. So I'm constantly looking for things that are interesting and having conversations and trying to figure out ways that we can feed good ideas to get to a point of something that can now kind of move into the publishing phase. So, yeah, I mean, email me. We'll talk, but it may well be that it's like, we're kind of far away. I think that's a really interesting idea. Maybe we have a partner, we have a school that would be interested in something, I'm not sure how much we could put in, but there's certainly, maybe we can generate funding together because we have a clear path to taking the research work and moving it up to scale more quickly because we're working together. So, and that's part of conversations I'm having all the time, both at the outset and then because we have so much data. We have, there's a lot of kids using stuff. I'm guessing you can learn something from what's happening now that will help make everybody better. So can we start to build off of what we already have? What can we learn from that? And that has potentially more direct value to a publisher, potentially. So it's complicated. That's why we talk.
So we have a question online from Kristen Reed. She says, we have materials that we've developed for preschool teachers and are currently testing through an NSF and Hastings-Simmons Foundation grant. We have some findings about the effects of the math materials on preschool kids in math and learning. How would you recommend we go about finding a good publisher and contacting them?
Yeah, so if, I have no idea. I mean, I know how to do it. I know how to do it for me because I know who I mean, it's part of what I do. You want to have somebody to reach out to, I find. I mean, there are things that sometimes go to a general box somewhere and will find their way to me or to somebody. But my sense is a lot of this is still personal connections, unfortunately. And it's not like I have, got an idea, send it to whatever email my HMH email is, david.docterman@hmhco.com. That doesn't exist anywhere, that inbox for ideas and research. I try and do a good job of finding stuff that, if that's published somewhere, if somebody's written about it, and it's something that we're interested in, I hope that I find it, and I'm coming to you. But you want to make yourself known. You want to be waving your arms about in whatever way you can. I don't know how the other publishers work, but people send me stuff. They send me stuff through Harvard. They send me stuff through HMH, or they send it to, blind submissions. It's tough. Sorry, I can't be. I don't know how everybody else works.
I have a question about, I guess it's continuing on the same line, but how much of your curriculum development is done in-house versus work for hire versus the method you just talked about, something falling sort of into your lap? So there's three different approaches.
Yeah, it is kind of all over the place. So the history of Read 180 was it had 8 years of research before Scholastic, at the time Scholastic, Margie Mayer sort of reached out to Ted and said, this is cool, let's do something. Math 180 was more built from scratch. And so you have a mix. So there are internal editorial teams. There are parts that do get, once things are well formulated and you're now kind of ramping up to scale, there are often contractors or the organization is scaled up. We'll typically, for what we do, we have ongoing relationships with our academic advisors to review what we're doing, not necessarily reviewing everything. Sometimes some people want to, but most of the advisors don't want to look at every page and every word. When we do stuff with Marilyn Burns, she looks at every word. And it's great. But most people, it's really looking over our shoulder. We want to make sure we're still doing it right, so it's spot checking along the way. The development, the technology development is, again, a mix of, it depends, but a lot of it is done. We have an in-house team that does a lot of the work.
I'm just wondering, what are the problems you feel like schools are looking to solve? So where are you getting the input in terms of what schools are looking for?
So here's an interesting tension, and you may experience it yourselves, where as you look at the research and you look at the landscape and try and understand an issue, how do we reach these kids who've been disengaged from the system? And you find something, but it's not clear that the market is paying attention. And so this is where, I think one of the things that, as part of Scholastic, that group really invented an intervention market. There really wasn't one before, or much of one before Read 180, and created that. So I think that we have an obligation. When I talk, it's like there's media is one of the other players in here, and I had a meeting with a reporter at South by Southwest, and I said, listen, don't inflame, inform, right? Let's make sure people become, let's make everybody more aware of the issues so that they're looking at things that matter. And so there is a piece of this that I do think is creating a market, and there's also responding, because, I like the tension of a publisher. If you don't make something that's of value, you can't make the next thing. It's not like you go and get another grant to do a next unfinished symphony. You have to make something that people value, and I like that pressure. And having the sort of relationship, the peer pressure by having a foot in the academic world to say, and I want my academic partners to still want to work with me. So to have those dual obligations, have integrity with the research and still do something of value. And sometimes that means I have to meet the market, and sometimes a piece of this is I have to create a market. I have to make people aware of a need that they were not paying attention to before. And that's something we do, but some do more of it than others.
Yeah, I was wondering if we, say we do have some materials that we think are worth publishing and we'd like to get the attention of a publisher, and without having a good personal connection.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think it's advantageous to do some kind of self-publishing first as a way of putting it out there?
Yeah, I don't think that hurts. And I've seen, I remember going and meeting with Sharon Griffin, Number Worlds, right? So this was research that grew out of work from with Robbie Case and Bob Sigler. So that was called Right Worlds. This was for early math. And I went to her house, and she's building the kits in her house, right? And so she was getting it out there. And part of it is, get a little blurb in Ed Week or something. It's sort of, there are different ways to get noticed and kind of getting stuff out there. I mean, again, I think there are other people like me in different organizations that are kind of tracking. I hope, anyway, that there are. And when I see stuff, I'm fortunate that my job is to talk to everybody. And when Xiaodong Lin, I don't know if you know her at Teachers College, and the stories of achievement versus stories of struggle, and it's like, that's so cool. And so she's publishing these little books herself, and it's like, this is awesome. I'm like, hey, I have to just wave my arms internally sometimes to say this is good, but it may not be that we're ready as a publisher for that space. We're not primed to go into that market. So it isn't like, everybody's sitting waiting for the call that I've got something good. It has to be sort of a match to this is where we're investing now, and we're moving in that direction. So getting yourself sort of exposed in a polite way, I think is part of it. And it's this sort of, and then if people are talking about it, then it gets noticed.
Well, with that, I think we will wrap up. We're at the top of the hour. Thanks very much to David for joining us today. You've given us lots of food for thought. And thanks to our online participants as well. As I said, we've been recording this, and that recording will be available on the CIRCL website a little later this week. For those of the folks, particularly those online, just to remind folks to take the webinar evaluation that we just put in the window. It really helps us figure out how to make these events better for those who typically join us virtually. So again, everyone in the room, join me in thanking David for the presentation today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.